So, hello everyone. This is my Issues in IT YouTube assignment. So, what I'm going to be talking about today is password policy. Now, this is actually something that I do genuinely care about. I would like to get into security, and it's something that I'm quite interested in. So, finding a solution to password policy would be fantastic. It's something that I've not only personally run into in some of the experiences I've had, but I've talked to countless people who also share some similar frustrations as me. So let's get into it. So first of all, what is password policy? We've all probably heard this. Most of us can even probably rattle off some of the requirements for password policy without even really thinking about it because they've seen it on other sites. So for example, some general password policies you guys have probably seen before are a minimum length. Most passwords are between 8 to 12. There's a minimum age that is allowed for a password to sit. We'll talk about this later. There's generally a minimum number of alphanumeric characters that are allowed in a password. So, I mean, this kind of falls back into minimum length. I would say most users use words instead of numbers for their password, especially to fill in the gap when they're trying to reach a minimum. There's also generally a minimum number of non-alphanumeric characters that are allowed in a password. So things like one number, one symbol. We've seen that all the time. And the last two are a little less obvious, but sometimes they are in place. So sometimes there's a maximum number of repeated characters that are allowed in a password. I think that's garbage. I think it helps you with things like somebody making their password just 8 ones, for example. But I mean, in reality, you'd want more repeating characters because that actually increases the length of your password. And then the last one is whether spaces are allowed in the password or not. This is generally just how the database has been set up or some user policy. I'm not totally sure why a company would want to implement no spaces unless it was for something, other than really, I'm not sure. Honestly, I think spaces should be allowed no matter what. So first, we always run into, I make a password and it's great. I make this great new password. So I apologize for this password. This is what happens when you ask somebody to come up with a random password on spot. You end up with things like nerdy ned 3 exclamation. So at first glance, a user might think, okay, this is a pretty good password. It seems pretty random. It has 10 characters, which is a good length. It falls perfectly between the 8 and 12 that our password policy might have asked for. And we have one number, and we have one symbol, follows the rules, and we have at least one capital letter. Sometimes password policies will ask for that. However, this goes back to the age that you saw on the last slide, is 3 months later, your company will pop up a little message that says, you need to change your password. And you'll sit there and go, okay, well, being the clever person I am, we can all probably admit whether or not we've done this or not, but you can go, oh, well, I have a character in my password. Let's increment or decrement that. So your password turns into nerdy ned 4 exclamation, which if you look isn't really all that different. And most of the time, what I personally have an issue with of this 3 month later thing is you're generating 4 passwords a year, which is ridiculous. No one's going to really remember 4 passwords. We have to remember we're dealing with users who, when they are going to forget their password, they're going to make it easier for them to remember their passwords. So their password might get less complex the more passwords they have to remember, or they might just straight up write them down and put them on a post-it note under their monitor. I've seen this happen. So personally, I think the biggest flaw to password policy is the age. This whole change it after every 3 months. So I've talked to business experts about this and security experts about this and why. And they say, well, it all has to do with something called persistent access. So what is persistent access? In essence, it's the time a hacker would have access to the system in total if they got a hold of your password. So let's say we make up a company in our head, and after you start, you make a password, a hacker gets a hold of that password immediately. Okay, that password is now technically only good for 3 months because in 3 months you'll be changing that password. Which, okay, it seems pretty hard to argue with. Okay, yeah, I guess I really do want hackers to have less time in my system. That sounds great. But you have to ask yourself what you're changing that password to, right? In our last example, we just saw we incremented a digit in our password, and I'm sure most users are quite guilty of that. So what if we had a different proposition. What if we looked at password complexity as being the answer? Because I think users have an easier time remembering maybe one or a couple complex passwords as opposed to a handful of slightly varying passwords. That just sounds like a nuisance even to say. So, for example, if you go back to our previous example of Nerdy Ned 3 exclamation. If we look again, it has 10 characters, it has its one number, its one symbol, and at least one character. Now this is great, but I mean, most users can probably agree that they'll enter a word, and then to meet the quota of needing a number, they'll add it at the end, and then also needing a symbol, they'll also add it at the end. Which is fine. I mean, some users will mix it around, and don't get me wrong, that's great. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, you still only have a 10-character password. If I asked you right now, I'm thinking of an 8-letter word in my head. You would actually probably try to guess what that word is, right? It seems realistic. It's an 8-character word. So what if I offered you a different solution to the password policy? And I said, okay, ignore the number, ignore the symbol. These are all optional things if you want. The only real thing that I care about is length. So what you tell users is, I need you to create a password that is 4 words of at least 4 characters. So a user might sit there, and whether or not a user takes the short way out and they pick 4 character words, whether or not they include spaces or not, that's a choice totally up to them. You're still creating a 16 character password. That is 4 more characters than the maximum password policy asked for last time. That's incredible. There's actually, if you're interested, there's articles at the end of this presentation if you'd like to look. You can look further into detail about how adding numbers and in place of alphanumeric characters isn't really that creative. I know we think we're really great for adding 3s in where it's an E, but there's plenty of computer programs that are aware of that annotation, and they actually use it when they guess passwords. So they've seen that character length is really all that matters. So you can see in the example we have on the other side here, we've chosen 4 random words: duck, shoe, fridge, and disc. These are totally random. I mean, 2 of the words start with D. That's not really relevant. But if you look at it and I told you, okay, I'm thinking of a 21 character word. Guess it. You wouldn't even try. Like, at first glance, you would immediately go, what are you talking about? That's crazy. That's way too long of a word for me to guess. And exactly, that is the point. The length of the password is everything to the security of it. Having a number is great. If users want to add numbers to their password, all the merrier. You should encourage that. Same with symbols. Same with capital letters and spaces. These are all things that should be added to the password at the user's discretion of making their password more complex. But at the end of the day, if we can make users start creating 16 character passwords that at the end of 6 months, let's ignore I don't want to make 4 of these passwords every year. I would say personally that this password is plenty long. So what I would do is change it only twice a year. So now if you ask users to change their password only twice a year, it's really not that big of a deal. It immediately feels like less of a hassle. It's something that happens once a year as opposed to every 3 months. And the other thing that I appreciate, and I've tried to think about this and talk to other people about it. The one thing that you can maybe think about is, would you just change the words around in the password? And I personally think people wouldn't. I actually think that would make it more confusing for people. So in the example we see here, if you have duck, shoe, fridge, and disc, and you decided to switch disc and duck, that would make it more confusing for you. In your head, you'd sit there and you'd go, oh, no, like, what way was it now? And that makes it worse. So I think an easy solution to that would be users would come up with 4 more words. It's just the next 4 words you have to remember. And I've talked to people who said there's no way they could do it. Try it right now. Duck, shoe, fridge, disc. I guarantee if you wake up and you can still say that order tomorrow morning, like, it's worked. This is your new password. And what that brings me to is the sources. So here you can see I have IBM linked here. That's where I got generally most of my information on what current password policy looks like. And then Crambler has a really great article on talking about the complexity of a password being in its length and what we just talked about, and not in making characters and symbols. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and hopefully you agree or disagree and have other comments that you can apply to the password policy debate.